I'm very glad to introduce Robin Grille, with whom I've been in contact recently, because he published a book in English, and it was translated in French, and I was honored to preface this book coming this coming week, something like that. So Robin is an international speaker, psychologist, psychotherapist, and parenting educator. His articles on parenting and child development have been widely published and translated in Australia. Indeed, he's our only guest from Australia, and he's been published in the Journal of Psychohistory too. The books he authored was Parenting for a Peaceful World, Heart to Heart Parenting, and the latest title, Inner Child Journeys. So you were born in Uruguay, and you've moved to Australia at age 10. And so you say you have a fascination with the diverse cultural norms. And of course, that relates to psychology and to the work we do as psychohistorians. So this brief presentation with my warm welcome to leave you introduce your talk, and you'll have maybe 30 to 35 minutes. So when we reach like 30 minutes, I'll give you a sign saying that you'll have like 5 minutes or 10 minutes left. Well, we're not at 1 minute, you know, but we want to have space, room for interventions. So here we go.
I would appreciate that, Marc-André, very much if you could give me a 10 and 5 minute warning to help me to focus towards the finish of my talk, so that we can have plenty of time to engage with questions.
I'll do that.
Yeah. Thank you. It's hard for me to orient around time and focus on everything I'm saying.
Okay, I'll do that.
So thank you so much, Marc. It's terrific to see you, and it's quite a thrill actually to be with this group. Welcome to all of you. It really completes a very long cycle since I first, quite by accident, discovered the work of Lloyd de Moor's. Gosh, I think it was during the Balkan Wars, during the Balkan crisis. So that long ago, and it was like an explosion in my mind and heart in a very good way. And I became really an armchair student, furiously so, of psychohistory, but anthropology as well since then. And it then informed the book, my first book, Parenting for a Peaceful World, that Marc-André has just kindly written the foreword to in the French version. So it's tremendous to be with this association, and thank you so much for your invitation and your opportunity to speak about things that I care about, that are actually interestingly linked to the end of that book, which came out in 2005 with a very upbeat, perhaps an optimistic, very cautiously optimistic tone at the time, having discovered that as child rearing reforms gain pace in a very average sense around the world, that there are social progress, social evolutionary dividends that were absolutely measurable at the time. Just stepping back for a moment, I want to reiterate the title of my talk. The New Fascism: is this social devolution or growth panic? Social devolution or growth panic? I found that by the time that my book came out in French, I had to quickly issue a new epilogue to account for the things that had happened that I had not anticipated since the end of my book. Because when I first wrote the first edition and the second edition in English, it seemed like things were moving well in the direction, across a number of vectors. Again, generalizing a lot, but across the globe in the direction away from violence insofar as social evolution across many markers, ever since after the Second World War and the new era of human rights and the Declaration of Human Rights, and people starting to take that seriously as a concept with the International Court of Justice, that for the first time, the immunity of a leader no longer exists just because they're a president, etc. And we have bodies like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And despite all of the wars that never stopped, there was a steady plummet, really, in deaths caused by war, civil and international, around the world, down to something like 0.3% of people around the world dying as a result of battle, compared to something like 10% 200 years ago. In other words, it's not that things were anywhere near okay, not by a long shot, but comparing to history, when it was all the more horrible, as Lloyd de Mouse used to say, the further you go back in history, the more brutal it is for children, and as a result, of course, the more brutal that we are towards each other. And of course, there were extraordinary changes to social justice, areas of gender politics, as we move away from patriarchy, one big step at a time. We're not there yet by a long shot, but increasingly women in positions of more influence, and then rights being awarded to Indigenous people again around the world, land rights in Canada, in Australia. I'm just going to have to give you very, very few examples, but I did a very broad kind of analysis of this. Of course, some things, there are some negatives that, whereas the more vulgar and more brutal styles of dictatorship are definitely on the wane, or they were, I thought, at the end of my book. At the same time, there is a runaway sort of toxic behind the scenes influence from corporate powers that have brought us to the very, very brink of a climate catastrophe and more and more. So in a sense, it seems probably perhaps more accurate to say that we've moved our violence away from direct, overt violence towards each other, into violence, and an increasing violence towards the non-human environment on which we depend for our very breath, on which our children and grandchildren depend. So I was cautiously optimistic about this, and this is why I had to write a new epilogue for the French edition to say, oh my goodness, what has happened? There's been a regression. There really has been. In a number of hotspots around the world, a rollback of democratic advancements. A little disclaimer, by the way, when I say democracy, I think that our best democracies are still embryonic. Separation of powers is not complete yet. We haven't separated money from power. I won't go into it right now, but just to please understand that I think democracy is very much on a continuum, and it's still, in terms of nation state democracy, we're so much better off than we were 100, 200, 300 years ago, but there's still a long way to go. Coming back to the story, and I'm sure you've already spoken about this a lot in the conference so far. Need I say it? Donald Trump, Nigel Farage in England, and Marine Le Pen, and Viktor Orban, Netanyahu, increase in wars, the return of fascism, it would seem, even if it's not so unified. There isn't so much one figurehead and a manifesto, not necessarily a unifying Mein Kampf. And yet, collective consciousness, there's been a swing back, very, very palpably, very worryingly, in Australia, very much too. Exact parallel with Pauline Hanson and her One Nation Party. What worries me additionally is that this xenophobic patriotism that has revived, it seems to walk hand in hand with a kind of anti-environmentalist libertarianism. We want to be free to destroy the environment and own guns and drive big petrol cars, and nobody tells us what to do. That kind of antisocial, narcissistic, I think malignant libertarianism. So, of course, we're all worried about that. But what I want to propose today is that this is a backlash. I see that this social phenomenon internationally as through the lens of backlash, sociologically a backlash, a growth panic in response or reaction rather to the accelerated changes that have come, which I think are to a large extent driven by key child rearing reforms around the world. Countries around the world are voluntarily, just one example of many, for example, making it illegal for a parent to strike a child. I think there's 65 nations around the world where that is considered domestic violence for the first time in human history. And over 130 countries around the world where it's considered, it's illegal for school teachers to strike a child. Now that was unthinkable in my childhood, unthinkable. Except in Uruguay, which was very advanced where I was born. So it was illegal at school, but certainly not at home. So when I came to Australia and I saw that teachers were hitting us with a cane, I thought we had come to an utterly barbaric place, utterly barbaric. And of course, I was right at the time. So what is the backlash to exactly? What is this growth panic about? I think it's about a number of things, and my viewpoint comes inescapably from my background and my training as a psychotherapist of 30 plus years. My training was in somatic psychotherapy, body-oriented psychotherapy. You know, think of you know, from the lineage of people like Wilhelm Reich and Alexander Lowen and people that have come since, you know, character analytic work of Wilhelm Reich. So that's the way that I see relationships and human organism. That's, I guess, my language. So of course, what I see will be completely tainted by my personal experience and training. And so what I look for to try to understand this backlash is when I listen to the rhetoric of speakers for this neo-fascism around the world, including Pauline Hanson and her One Nation Party in Australia, I don't listen to what they say. I don't listen to the ideology so much as what I listen for obsessions. I listen for exaggerations, because I believe that an ideology is nothing more than a frontal lobe rationale for unexamined, deep unconscious emotional reaction. Okay. So if I'm frightened of homosexuals and I hate Asian people, My frontal lobes are extraordinarily clever at coming up with a very clever, with a good rationale for why these people should be kept at bay. And of course, I have nothing against homosexuals and Asian people. Some of my best friends are homosexuals and Asian people, but they shouldn't have political power in Australia. I wish them well. I love those people, but you know, we can come up with very diplomatic rationale. So the ideology doesn't say as much of the truth, I think, as I listen for the energy in this neo-fascist rhetoric. And there seems to be this obsession with wokeism. And those of you that are in the United States will have heard that way too often. And if you're in Europe, I don't know, Marc-André, if that's a word that politicians use, wokeism. Everyone is freaked out by wokeism. Like the transgender people are going to take over the world and they're going to convert all of our children. You know, I'm okay that there are issues to be discussed. There are potential problems with all of that. Trend, fine, but what is it? How come this has become the key passion almost for this political movement? And we're hearing talk of vermin from the likes of Donald Trump who are invading and poisoning our societies. You know, migrants, waves of migrants, vastly exaggerated, paranoid, sweeping claims at a time when migration is going to be increasingly, I think nations will be competing for migrants as fertility rates fall off a cliff in Western countries. You know, absolutely essential to have migration in these countries. If you until we learn how to shrink an economy in a healthy way, we will need migration to keep the economy going and growing. And that migration in the United States, for example, is bringing down crime because crime amongst migrants is lower than amongst a native citizens on average. So what is happening? So I think what is stirring up this growth panic, this backlash, a lot of it is an identity crisis. I want to look at it through the lens of identity. And what is the threat to our sense of identity insofar as the group that we belong to? Why is identity so seemingly important for not everyone, but for a lot of people, that we cling to it? We will fight and die for our identity in a way that this passion for preserving the identity sometimes overrides our biological survival impulses. It can be that important. And why do some people not cling to identity so hard? Why are some of us a little bit more able to let go and be allowed to change and to be fluid in our allegiances, some more than others? What is that? There are, I think, with the time that I have today, I'll just talk about this thing of identity. I think that there are other deep psychological forces at play as well, which I can't fit them in this talk. But I do think that there is, as patriarchy wanes in the face of an evening of gender dynamics politically around the world, socially around the world, patriarchy is saying goodbye. I think there's a lot of male castration anxiety about. Okay, patriarchy is under threat. It is cornered, and it is starting to growl in some corners of the world. I think that there's deep collective unconscious fears of maternal engulfment. And right now we're going back to a pre-verbal trauma. All of these things animate it gets politicized until a moment of insight in which we realize that the fear is in here and not a threat is out there in the migrants and the gay people, etc., etc., etc. But of course, that requires a psychological maturity that it's still rare around the world. But I will focus on this one thing that I'm thinking about, which is identity, with the time that I have. What are our threats to identity? Plummeting fertility, mass migration. There was a French author, Renaud Camus, and in 2011, he published a book called Le Grand Remplacement, the Great Replacement Theory, which was adopted very heartily in the United States and in Australia. That I hate using racial terms. There is no such thing as race. There is a genetic illusion. No such thing as race. However, we have these cultural kind of attachments to what race means. So I'm going to say white people, whatever the hell that is. And some white people are really attached to this idea of great replacement. We're being deliberately replaced, white people, by other races who are invading us. And I mean, that kind of rhetoric is so equivalent to what was going on in the 1930s. Someone once said, if we didn't have Jews, we would have had to invent them. We're inventing the Jews again. My parents were in the Holocaust in Romania, by the way. Then they migrated to Uruguay after communism in Romania. And my father was equally terrified of communism as he was of Nazism. So I guess partly I'm doing this presentation in his honor, my departed father. So the threat of mass migration, there is mass migration, climate change driving it, political strife, persecution, it's enormous. And alongside that, the traditional mum and dad family, that's changing rapidly. You know, I think 36 countries now that have marriage equality. We look out the window, we don't see the society that we used to see. We're not the same. This is not our grandparents' society anymore in the so-called Western world. We have to learn to say goodbye to that. Now, I have a lot of sympathy, even as a double migrant, really. I was already the son of migrants in South America. I already knew I was a stranger right from the beginning. But I do have sympathy for what that feels like to have lived all one's life in an environment that is culturally homogenous, and that has gone, and that the songs that we used to hear as children, the jokes we used to hear as children, the food we used to have as children is not dominant anymore. And suddenly we're exposed to a diversity that we hadn't really signed up for. I have a lot of sympathy for that being scary and difficult and painful as a transition, that we are losing the sense of nationhood. I do think nations, of course, were an absolute fiction. They were invented about 200 years ago. If you look at the composition of nations, people were shoved together that did not speak the same language as each other. The invention of Italy, the invention of Germany, the invention of France. Australia was an absolute fiction. There's several hundred different nations, Aboriginally speaking, in Australia, etc., etc. So we drew lines in the map. The Middle East is a random invention, divided up between the Brits and the French at the time, the colonists. Those lines don't represent anything related to people. So that even though the nation is a fiction, but then we fixated on that being our identity, like life depends on it. And we're presented with an imperative now of it's no longer that way. We're losing that homogeneity quickly, or we've lost it already. And patriarchy, the patriarchal family with the patriarch at the head, and mums do what dad says, that is gone. Everything that's familiar. I think, of course, that's a threat. If we are to the degree that we are attached to those things and don't have the resources emotionally, psychologically to welcome the new, the unfamiliar, indeed to even take pleasure from that and the growth that it implies, of course, that's threatening. And why do some of us have the ability to accept the new and to, if necessary, to grieve the past, to grieve it well? It's okay to have nostalgia. It's okay to you know, to have a tear in the eye about the days when we were all like this and we were all like that. That's okay. But what is it that gives somebody the strength of heart to then move on to the new reality that's being presented as we intermix so much? We diversify and free up the notion of what a family in a village means. To some, it's terrifying and unthinkable, and to some of us, it can be exciting. It can be exciting. Now, is this attachment to identity? Is it something that's genetically determined? Because it has been around a very long time. Anthropologists are saying that there's so many examples that for thousands of years, some cultures around the world that refused interesting innovation of the culture next door to them, even though it would have been better for their survival. But they refused it because some of what drives the cultural definition is the desire, a group desire to show oneself as different, to define oneself in opposition to the neighbor, sometimes to the expense of our well-being. The neighbor might be using canoes. That would be good for us to do fishing with. We would have more abundance, but we're not canoe people. They're the canoe people, okay? Stay away from the canoe people. They're vermin. Let's build a wall. Keep the canoes out. But that's happened a lot. And what is it about that? And I remember as a little boy in Uruguay that the social battle lines were drawn very strictly between the boys that backed. So there was two top teams in the soccer competition, the Peñarol y Nacional. The first thing, if you approach a bunch of boys, the first thing they'd look at you and say, are you with Peñarol or Nacional? And if you say the wrong team, you're not playing with us. Get out of here. Wow, where did they learn to do that? And so it's a fair question to ask, is this identitarianism? Is it genetically determined, or is it something that is a reaction to an environmental pressure of some kind? I think the potential is there genetically, but then the fixation, getting stuck there, that's not genetic. My bias is that it's an environmental pressure. But I think it's a developmental stage. And I think the issue comes when we get stuck and fail to move through that stage. If you look at the developmental stages of Erik Erikson, the psychologist Erik Erikson, interesting and beautiful. And it's firmly backed up now with modern developmental neuropsychology. in the stage of adolescence, there is quite universally a deep longing to join a tribe, a group of like-minded people that we will wear the same clothing and sing the same songs. And this quite forceful passion for identity and wearing the club colors. It seems so important in high school. What kind of kid are you? Are you the sporty kid? Or are you, we had these tribal names in Australia in high school, and the tribal names for all the kids for the young folk in other countries as well. You know, we had the nerds and we had the geeks and we had the, you know, the jocks, and you know, everyone has different dialects about this, of course, but it seems so important. It seems so important, and we seem to gain the longing is, it's like a prototype of where do I fit in? You know, we are the human animal is defined by being not an individual only. That's a part of a polarity of existence, but we are because of our society and our belonging to the society. And we are a group, we are a crowd-sourced species. That's what gives us our success on this beautiful planet, for better and for worse. We're starting to learn as adolescents, it's a lot about society, because soon I won't get my food and my roof from mum and dad anymore. And those people that I depend on, they're going to want me to contribute something. Who am I? I am what I contribute, and I am the place where I belong. That's all of that's going on very, very powerfully in adolescence. And then I think we're supposed to, if there is enough support, the right kind of support through adolescence, then this need is fulfilled just enough that in an organic way, it gives us hopefully a sense of new curiosity, where it's fine to belong to a club, but also you want to see what the other clubs are doing. And to the extent that we have enough love and support for being this, we start to look out the window. And then in later adolescence, I think the healthier young folk, there starts to be a curiosity and a longing to burst outside of the familiar bubble, a new longing to be uncomfortable, a longing, a pleasure, a kind of a thrill. It's a bit scary, but there's also a thrill involved in being in uncomfortable places and moving away from the shared mindset of our culture and our family, bursting out of that bubble.
We've been going for half an hour now, just to be clear. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to then, my task is to try to finish in 5 minutes. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Now, I think ultimately health of society is utterly dependent on diversity. I think diversity is almost another word synonymous for health. It's also the same can be true for the microbes in soil. The more diverse, the healthier the soil and the better the plants. The same is true for the gut biology, the microbiota in the human gut. The more diverse, the healthier we are, the healthier our immune system. The healthier the immune system of a society is, the more diverse the society is. So as well as we have an impulse to clutch onto and attach onto identity, there's also a deeper healthy impulse to diversify and to learn from other cultures, to absorb the intelligences that other cultural experiments have to offer, and to be willing to let go of little pieces of our own. If we don't make that transition, we stay stuck, and then potentially we become malignant in this attachment. And you're seeing that politically now. I think that the strength and passion of this new fascism is equal proportionately to the strength of the changes that have already unfolded, which I think are quite unstoppable. I do not believe we will become arrested. I think backlash is the inevitable social reaction before a change becomes absolute. Except the positive changes never make the news. They don't make the news. You have to go find them yourself. So from attachment to healthy curiosity, what do we need to do in terms of child rearing reform? That's the question that this begs, in order to help the younger generation to be able to face the challenges of diversification of humanity without paralyzing fear. How do we foster this natural curiosity that does start to emerge? I want to take a little detour very quickly to say that I believe the human condition to be that we're stuck in the past. The nervous system perceives the past, and we are incessantly projecting our own past onto the present. That's it's an interesting way to try to define the human condition. We project onto each other. We blame each other for things. We blame our children. We project onto ourselves as well. That's not irrevocable. It's possible to see the present freed from our experience, but that's a hard one aspect of our growth, and yet we long for that. The human organism longs for that. It longs for that.
Can you conclude?
And my conclusion is, I'll have to say it very quickly for something that deserves, hours of talk, of course. But healthy attachment early is one dimension. When we have our attachment needs met well enough in the first 3 years of life, that's what enables us to let go of attachment, to be more fluid, to be able to grieve well and move on. That's one thing. I also think that we need to utterly revolutionize education systems around the world. By and large, with the exceptions of some progressive schooling systems of note, which I could mention later, because I'm a very big fan of that. Our schools are institutions where flow states, that necessary human flow state, is almost impossible. You start enjoying your maths class, bang, the bell goes and you've got to move somewhere else. You can't stay. Schools aren't places, by and large, that really well enough, in many schools not even at all, do they help young people, adolescents, to follow their passion, their natural passion. They're places of coercion. This shatters the connection to who we are.
Well,
and I'm noticing that in schools where this does happen, like democratic schools in Israel or Sudbury system in the States, a whole bunch of different ones, violence in school goes down. There's when kids are allowed to, young people are allowed to follow what they love, they not interested in fighting. The curiosity emerges.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, may I interrupt you?
Yes.
And thank you very much, Robin. You have thrown many things on the table, and I am sure that participants will want to react, to add, to question. And so